Hi, everyone. I'm Richard Piacentini, President and CEO for Phipps Conservatory and Botanical Gardens, and I'd like to welcome you to the third webinar of the Climate Toolkit. It's a pleasure to have all of you with us today, and our conversation today is on how to talk to your stakeholders about climate change. And we have presenters from Phipps Conservatory and the Morton Arboretum to share their tips on how to tell the story of climate change to a variety of audiences. Before we get started, I just want to note that in May, the Science Museum of Minnesota became the first museum to join the toolkit. And remind everyone that the toolkit isn't just for gardens. We're pleased to welcome zoos, museums, and other cultural institutions to join in this important project. But of course, we'd also love to have all our gardens involved in this as well. So if your garden's not a member right now, I encourage you to join us and share what you're doing to address climate change at your institution. I also want to mention that we're forming a Climate Toolkit Technical Advisory Committee, and would love to have your garden staff be a part of this exciting new group who help us by brainstorming, testing, and reviewing new materials and sharing the Climate Toolkit with fellow professionals. There's a link posted in the chat for anyone who wants to sign up, and we hope that you'll consider joining us in this way. As the presentation begins, you're welcome to use the Zoom chat function, enter questions, which we'll answer after the talks have concluded. For our first talk, I'd like to welcome our first presenters, Dr. Sarah States, Director of Research and Science Education at Phipps, and Dr. Maria Wheeler-Dubas, Science Education and Outreach Manager at Phipps. Sarah and Maria.
Thanks, Richard. Hello, everyone. I'm just going to have Maria share the screen and I'll get started. So while she's doing that, Maria and I have the distinct pleasure of leading science communication workshops for scientists, for science grad students, professionals, and faculty to help them better engage with the public and share their research with the public. And so I'm hoping that we can share those tools with you to help you find ways to share information about climate change with your garden members. So there's a study on Americans' knowledge of climate change in 2010 by Lazarowitz et al. And it showed that museums are among the most trusted sources of information on climate change, which is great. However, the same study showed that only 21% of Americans that were polled had learned a lot or some information about climate change at these institutions. So we're clearly not talking about climate change very much. And this presents a huge opportunity. Talking about climate change can present many challenges. We come up against cultural and political and religious conflicts. So we will today just briefly explore some communication strategies to talk about tough topics in a more accessible and personalized and empathetic way. I think I need to request remote control, Maria, so I can advance the slides. Hopefully that will work. Give me a moment. There we go. All right. So there's a really great resource, which is the Yale Program on Climate Change Communication. And they have been surveying Americans since 2008 to assess their beliefs and their knowledge and their behaviors around climate change. And this is known as Global Warming 6 Americas. So they survey a representative sample of Americans, and they segment Americans into these 6 groups of their engagement on climate change. So on the left, we have folks who are alarmed when it comes to climate change. They're really engaged, they're concerned, they think it's here and it's now. And on the other end of the spectrum, we have some folks who are dismissive. They think climate change is a hoax. And if you go to this website, there's a plethora of information about Americans' understanding of climate change. And you can track how folks have been engaging with climate change for about 12 years now. You can actually access the survey questions and the methodologies to use these surveys in your own gardens. And that's what Phipps did in 2016. We wanted to know where our visitors stood when it came to climate change. And we sampled about 1,000 visitors who came to FIPS, and we have a small number that were alarmed, but you can see that over 50% were seriously concerned about climate change. And the folks in these red and yellow segments, these are the people that believe climate change is real, but they're less engaged. So there's a huge opportunity here for you to talk about climate change with them. They are interested and listening to you and looking to you to be a resource. And this actually spearheaded a lot of the work that we have done at FIPS. I know Richard has talked about this in the past, but our Green Power Drive and providing more resources for folks to take action on climate change. So this is just some background as an introductory way for you to better understand where your visitors are when it comes to climate change. And so when we do our workshops, we like to ask folks 2 questions first. What does your audience know about climate change or science topic? And also, how do they feel about climate change? Scientists aren't always used to talking about feelings, but we really ask people to think about this when they're engaging with the public, because your emotions and your feelings really affect your behaviors and your perceptions about science. So this first question, we want folks to assess the prior knowledge and the understanding that garden visitors and the public already have around climate change. And so these are just a brief set of questions and thoughts for you to consider when you're talking about climate change or other controversial topics. So you already know a lot about your members and about your region. So you send out membership surveys, you're asking folks questions about their interests. There's a lot of local demographic information that's already available. You can use this to your advantage to understand where folks, what folks might already know about climate change. And then you can also think about what folks might find interesting. Are there direct or indirect connections to climate change in the programs that you're already offering, the exhibits that you have? And also thinking about local sources of pride, local history, and cultural elements that may connect to climate-related issues. And one thing that we think is very important is the level at which you present this information. Generally at FIPS, we present information at about a 5th to 7th grade level in exhibits or signage, because frankly, not everyone has had a science course recently. You know, it's been years since a lot of folks have had a class on science. And we don't consider this dumbing, we don't say it's dumbing things down. We're simplifying, we're making this information accessible. Everyone is an expert in something. And we find that this level, a 5th to 7th grade level, is the most accessible level of information for folks. I'm going to talk a bit about what folks are feeling about climate change. We ask our scientists to think about all the stakeholders that might be involved in an issue. So for a controversial topic like climate change, and each stakeholder, what is their motivation for engaging with this issue? Where are they coming from? Do they have a financial stake in this issue? Are there cultural or religious elements that might make them more likely to engage or less likely to engage with climate topics? Are there health concerns? And this is going to come up a bit later. We're going to do a brief breakout session to explore this diagram a bit more. So we ask folks to think about all the different stakeholders involved in this issue. What are their motivations for engaging with climate change? And what would a science communicator need to understand before engaging in conversation? And so when we talk about climate change in Western Pennsylvania, there are a lot of different feelings and attitudes. You know, Pennsylvania and Western Pennsylvania in particular is built on coal and steel industries. And a lot of family pride and community pride is tied to these extractive industries. And we can't ignore that. So this is just a quick example to show all the different groups a subset of the groups that are involved in the way we think about climate change and the way we engage with folks in this region. So we'll ask you to come back and think about the folks, the stakeholders in your regions and how they might feel and think about climate change. I'm going to shift over to Maria and let her continue the conversation.
There we go. I unmuted. So thanks, Sarah. All right, so we talked a little bit about trying to assess what your audience might know about climate change or how they might feel about climate change. But now we're going to talk a little bit about the language involved in actually having those climate conversations or even building your climate signage. And specifically, we want to address the technical terms that go into talking about climate change because it's a technical topic. But we want to make that, like Sarah said, as accessible to everyone. And this quote that we have here on your screen is something that we share with, again, our scientists who take our science communication workshops. And the quote, for those of you who are listening in, jargon can be a, jargon can be a tool, a weapon, a wall, or a bridge. Jargon is important shorthand within a field, but language that can be used to keep others out or shut others down. And we want to make sure that our language is being a bridge with other folks. So what is jargon exactly? Well, jargon comes in many forms. So on the one hand, you can have very technical terms that come up when you're discussing climate. And then you can have like buzzwords. So buzzy, popular words that maybe they've entered pop culture vernacular. Maybe they mean in pop culture vernacular exactly what they're supposed to. Maybe they don't. And then there's just sometimes those million-dollar words or confusing phrases like elucidate or systems. So they're words that aren't necessarily super common, and maybe we can just go with a more straightforward word instead of that. But the tricky thing about jargon, and part of why it's not just a cut and dry, here's a list of words to avoid and a list of words to use, is that jargon is going to vary depending on your audience. So for example, at FIPS, one of the events that we have on a monthly basis is our environmental film series. Now, our regular attendees at that film series, we know them pretty well. We have a lot of folks that have been coming for years. That particular audience, they're not made up of scientists, but they are made up of folks who are really engaged in environmental issues in Western Pennsylvania. They're very well read. They do a lot of research. So this paragraph that I have here on the screen, I would feel comfortable sharing this paragraph with them and they'd be perfectly fine with it, because I know that that subset of our overall FIPS regular attenders would be very comfortable with the language here. On the flip side, I might not necessarily want to put this exact paragraph on a sign that's going to go right in the middle of our garden or in our children's garden, because the terminology isn't appropriate for all settings. So that's the tricky bit about managing your jargon, is knowing what audience is going to see, hear, or read something. But it's just a matter of when maybe you're sitting down with your team and you're thinking about what's the message you want to convey to a particular audience, then you can plan appropriately. What jargon or technical terms do I feel like really need to be a part of this message? And when will a simpler phrase or a more accessible term be more appropriate? Now, I do want to take a moment to pause here, because so far we've been talking a lot about information. So what information does your audience know? How does your audience feel about that information? What's the best way to share that information? But I want to make sure that I also clarify that having climate conversations isn't just all about the information. A lot of times it's about something deeper. It's about the relationships that you might have with the person you're talking to. As gardens, as cultural institutions, we do have the advantage of having a good relationship with our community. So true communication, especially in trickier subjects, a lot of times it comes back to having a relationship. Because otherwise, if all we're doing is trying to transmit information, we're running into something called the deficit model. So the deficit model posits that skepticism and even hostility to scientific concepts arise from a lack of knowledge. So the best way to counter that is just with more information. But sometimes that can feel a little like this, where we have our really super enthusiastic gardens and scientists, and we've got all the research, we've got all the data, we've got all the studies, and we're just gonna pour it over this super excited visitor who wants to hear all of this right now. Yeah, no, that doesn't necessarily always work. So having those relationships like you've been able to build up with your communities, that is going to be a huge key part. So when you know how your audience feels about a subject, what they know about a subject, and you've tailored your language, those are really important tools for talking about climate with audiences that maybe aren't used to having that conversation. And very briefly, we're going to mention my last, and maybe because I'm a Disney fan, favorite tool, and that is storytelling. So storytelling is a fantastic way to share new and different concepts with folks. And why stories? Well, because we as humans are hardwired to remember stories. We connect with stories on an emotional level, on an intellectual level, on a physiological level, if you're getting really into a story or book or movie that you're watching. And we're about 20 times as likely to remember a story than we are a fact. So stories are a great way to make an impression on someone. So for example, here in Western Pennsylvania, I could say that we're trending warmer and wetter over this past century. Here's my data, here's my lovely graph, that's information you can't argue with. There we go. Cool. Or I could come at it from a story angle. So in Pennsylvania, the combination of aging infrastructure and increased rainfall over the last several years has combined to result in this really unfortunate situation in our hilly landscapes. And that is the fact we've had a lot of landslides and quite a fair bit of flooding. This is real and this is tangible to folks. And actually, this is a road that I've driven on plenty of times before. There's an apartment building at the bottom of the hill. Those families all had to move out for a couple of weeks because a road fell into their apartment building after a heavy rain. So that's really meaningful and can connect to folks. So you can talk about a story and then you can talk about why that, what's factoring into that, what's happening. But I do want to say, it doesn't have to be doom and gloom. Cautionary stories, yes, are valuable, but so are empowering stories. Stories that, you know, are heartwarming and give you the warm fuzzies. Like this group of kids here who are, you know, they're involved in taking control of their own future and they're planting trees. So that's an empowering story that I'm sure you have plenty of in your own areas. So any way to emotionally connect with your audiences is a great way to get points across. And with that, I'd like to thank you for joining us. And we're actually going to turn things over now. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. We're going to turn things over to Jeremy Jocelyn, who is the Director of Education at the Morton Arboretum in the Greater Chicago area.
Thank you, Maria. Yeah, I will remember to unmute and then get my screen share going as well. I don't need to say more about myself. I'm the Director of Education at the Morton Arboretum. I will say Sarah and Maria heard my written praise of their slides earlier in the week. I've already shared them with peers at the Arboretum with a note about, you know, as we look at what we want to accomplish in terms of climate change and positive engagement with stakeholders. This is how, when we find a gap in our current efforts and what we want to accomplish, that's how we build structure to build a bridge between what we're doing and what we want. I'll tell everyone, I'm going to go a little broader in terms of engaging stakeholders. I will definitely back up Sarah's point that we are not always talking enough about climate change. And Morton has gone on quite a journey over the past 4 years, from really shying away from this hot button topic to putting it front and center in how we communicate to people. And so I'll talk a little bit about that journey, but then I'll talk about how we're actually engaging audiences now and really spreading climate change information across programs. So it's not just a climate change program. All of our programs should be climate change programs. So I will say I started as the director of education at the end of 2017. And climate change was off limits, which was surprising to me as somebody coming to the garden world from higher education. We were finally able to crack this in terms of, okay, we can actually program for climate change as long as we do it with through a tree-focused lens. And that led to our first ever program where we were publicly talking about climate change in 2018, which is not that long ago. Honestly, you know, when I tell this story, I'm a bit embarrassed, but we were able to get internal stakeholders to buy into the idea of talking publicly about climate change because we use trees as kind of a metaphor for why this is important. And yes, climate change is real and actually impacting our world. So that started with this 2018 program called The Future of Trees, Hope in a Changing Climate. And if you've ever heard a workshopped program title, that is one of them. But so even, you know, the longest journey has to start with the first step. This was our first public climate change program. Thankfully, it hasn't been the last. Each year around Earth Day or Arbor Day, we revive the program and we have a panel of experts talking either about how climate change has impacted trees, but really trying to speak positively about how our audiences can take action to mitigate that change. Like Maria said, we don't want to be all doom and gloom when we tell these stories. We want to give people a sense of hope. We want to show them the possibilities that their actions have and then empower them to go out and take them once they've heard our messaging. And that's even continued through COVID-19, through the shutdown. We were able to move all of these programs from in-person to online and keep this messaging going in a really positive way. Now, you want to talk about a big change. Like I said, Morton went from not talking about climate change at all as late as 2017 to making it a key pursuit in our latest strategic plan. And I will say, so we were in between vice presidents in my area when the plan was written. So I got to be in the room for a lot of the editing and creation of these pursuits. And it was really exciting to see, yes, we are an arboretum. So we're tree focused. We're an outdoor tree museum that's always going to be there. And even that pursuit has two offshoots of specific strategies that we can take action on about oak conservation and connecting urban trees to, or urban people to trees. But we also added these three other areas: climate, sustainability, and inclusion. And it was exciting to see Arboretum leadership be that transparent about what our priorities should be as we approach our centennial and we look to the future of the Morton Arboretum. It's exciting, but it's also challenging at times because when you've got so many kind of unexplored areas to prioritize, it almost feels like we're building a railroad track while we're sitting on a locomotive. And that's what we're doing right now as we kind of establish the outcomes and the objectives of the climate pursuit. So for those of you just on the phone, for climate, the language around it is ensuring resilient trees for the future at the Arboretum and in the Chicago region. So still, we have a lens of trees in how we're addressing climate change. This was, like I said, this was a really interesting process to see this develop over time. Our strategic plan, it started as a really long list of things that people and staff were excited to address and wanted to see in the plan. So we've got climate change. I mentioned oak conservation, urban trees and people. We were really focused on what do we need to do to be more inclusive and accessible to our community. We also knew that we needed to be able to grow, but we also wanted to do that in an environmentally sustainable manner. And then we had the centennial coming up. So there were all these things as we worked on this in 2019. And eventually what emerged were 4 succinct themes, or at least a little more succinct. And this graphic will come back at the end of my slides, because like I said, in the previous slide, you see we have 4 main pursuits: trees, climate, inclusion, and sustainability. This was a really interesting process to be a part of because in terms of stakeholders, we wanted to be able to address not just our audience, but we had to get internal buy-in on the idea of talking about such a hot button topic like climate change. There was a lot of grassroots passion from staff who were frustrated that the Arboretum wasn't already doing more on this messaging. And I will admit, I was a part of that group, and I heard from members of my staff that had been there longer than I had. And so it was really a mix of like, leadership kind of saying, okay, this is our direction, but also other staff, from the bottom up going, well, this is what we're already doing. Can't we reframe that as relevant to these pursuits? So we're not pivoting too far in terms of what we're doing. We're just doing it towards slightly different goals. And what we ended up doing was establishing a multi-department focus group of staff to say, okay, what does this climate pursuit actually look like now? What do we think we can accomplish in the mid and long term? And then how do we build a bridge from what we're doing now to those longer term goals that we want to accomplish? Nobody wants to see this plan sit on a shelf. We want to actually have goals that we can work toward and capture in ways that, demonstrate positive change. I will say too, this is, I mentioned it's an internal stakeholder audience. The staff needs engagement on climate change too, especially during COVID and shelter in place. We got really engaged internally. We started a book club on Project Drawdown. So if anybody's familiar with that, it's a list of, actionable climate change solutions across a variety of topics. And what's interesting is, like I mentioned, Morton got the green light to talk about climate change as long as we did it through a trees lens. Well, trees are obviously not the only solution that can have positive impact on climate change. And if climate change is part of our strategic plan, what's out of bounds for us to program to be concerned about? And then with sustainability as an additional pillar, how do we define that overlap? Sustainable practices will have positive climate impact. Can we be a model for the community by increasing our sustainable practices and tie that into our climate change messaging? I would argue that we can, and I think that's the direction we're headed. And these were all really deep philosophical discussions to have while really we had nothing else to do. We couldn't program because we were all stuck in our houses. And then even as we were doing that, Project Drawdown released their 2020 update, which were new resources and new facts and figures on the solutions they had and what they thought were most actionable towards mitigating climate change. So it's really, the timing felt right. As frustrating as it was to have just approved a new plan and then immediately go into lockdown, it really gave us time to think through, okay, when we do start to come back, what's our programming going to look like? How far can we push this in terms of institutional messaging and outreach to audiences about what climate change is and how we can actually have a positive impact that we probably wouldn't have time to have done if we were still programming like normal. Well, so what? So this is the question that we ask all the time. In terms of our climate change pursuit, if anybody can't read that, so we ended up with 5 distinct objectives that follow this pursuit, and they're advancing expertise, making the Arboretum climate ready, engaging and influencing Arboretum audiences to be part of the solution, that's the actionable part, develop and grow resilient trees, and then lead a national tree adaptation strategy. I admit, when those were first written, I thought they were great. I thought they were concise and actionable. And what we found out was the more we waded into it, even then, there's some fuzziness to a lot of these that we have to still nail down. When we talk about expertise, are we talking about our communication expertise, like Sarah and Maria were just talking about? Are we talking about our science staff and reframing their current research to be more relevant to climate change? Are we talking about even just, our evaluation expertise? If we're making this part of our messaging, how are we capturing if we're having positive impact with our audiences? So it's been quite a debate, I will tell you. Like I said, this is where the train track locomotive metaphor came from, because as the co-lead on the efforts to build a roadmap to accomplish these objectives, there's a lot that we do that's tied to climate change. There's a lot we want to have happen. And now the challenge is building a bridge between the two, from today to those the road. So we do that by really being defined outcomes, metrics, and success factors for what we want to have happen, nested on top of what we're already doing. So right now for the Arboretum, actually cataloging all of the climate relevant initiatives that are because the more you think about it, the more you come up with. It's not just engaging audiences in programming, but like I said, it's for the horticulture staff. It's building a narrative around the impact of climate change that development can use, and encouraging contributed donations as a form of taking action. There's all of these current initiatives, and then we have to say, okay, now that we have them cataloged, what do we want out of them? What's going to be a 5-year outcome of something like moving to battery powered equipment for the horticulture staff? What's a metric that we can use to assess whether or not that happens? What's a success factor that we need in place to make sure these efforts continue? So it's a interesting combination of like cataloging current efforts and then kind of imagining what we think these current efforts will bring and building a structure that we can capture those outcomes on. But this is the good news, I guess, about climate change, is that there's no tomorrow solution. We know that this is a big enough issue. The only way to continue is to really break it up into some small steps to get started, and then we can build to larger and larger solutions. Again, and like I said, there's still some fuzziness to these objectives, because if you go back to the previous slide, you look at that 5th objective, leading a national tree adaptation strategy, that starts to feel an awful lot like, instead of its own objective, that's a long-term outcome of making the Arboretum climate ready, of developing and growing new and resilient trees. So even then, there's some confusion about, okay, are we actually coming up with completely separate objectives, or are we building a plan to see what we want to see happen if we do all these other things correctly now? So again, even, it's something that we're working on, and that's why meetings like this are so important, because the more we can talk about it together with our peers, I think the clearer it's going to be, and the easier it will be to actually kind of say, yes, that's a goal, or no, that's just kind of a byproduct. Now, I think what everybody's really interested in is how are we engaging audiences on this content? And so I'm really thrilled to say we've, at least at the Arboretum, we've gotten past this, an annual climate event, and we've been able to incorporate content into a lot of different programs. Now, the challenge is, like Maria was talking about, in terms of storytelling and making a connection, different audiences have different levels of readiness to take action. They have different levels of ability to take action. So you kind of have to tailor your approach depending on who you're connecting with. Another botanist at a garden has a very different audience profile than a middle school volunteer in your children's garden. But you can talk to climate change to both of them. You'll get different things out of it, but you have to take a different approach each time. And so we've started that process at the Arboretum. Some of our real successes in the past 4+ years have been things like eco challenges. For younger audiences, we've really found success tying it into even, making a competition about who can be the most eco-friendly as they engage with the Arboretum. This has been great too. This came out of the book club, is new field trip content for middle and high school age students, using data from our forest ecologists and building some problem-based learning around climate change from real data, using prediction models on temperature and water and pests, and saying, if this continues, what's it going to look like? And then what are some steps we can take to mitigate those changes? And talking to students about real kind of work that the science staff is doing in our education programs. This one, I have to say, this hasn't happened yet, but I'm hopeful that at our next craft beer festival, we can actually badge vendors and have them answer, like, how sustainable are some of your brewing practices? I don't want to overshare about my own personal interests, but if you know about beer and brewing, there's a lot of opportunity there to reuse materials and be more sustainable than, some of the bigger breweries are. And I think this would be an exciting way to kind of see even events come into this conversation. And I'm really hoping that happens this summer. And the through line through all of those examples is the Arboretum needs to be the change we want to see. Like I said, I was really surprised in 2017. I was thinking as a new person, as an outsider, if a public garden, if an outdoor tree museum cannot talk about climate change. Who can? And I think a lot of our staff, a lot of our leadership have come around to that perspective. And now it's up to us, as the people creating content that engage audiences, we can really invite people into our circle. We can demonstrate best practices, we can encourage them to be active, and we can really be successful at that if we can model ourselves to them. And it's up to, like I said, it's being the change that we want to see in terms of climate change. I will say, I mentioned that this graphic was going to come back because, like I said, climate can be everything. I think I love this graphic because I think our marketing and design department was really intentional, because if you look and if you just expand the circles a little bit, you see that they overlap. And you see that eventually you can talk about climate and you can talk about trees. You can talk about climate and you can talk about sustainability. You can talk about climate and you can talk about inclusion, because really there's an equality aspect to who's going to be impacted the most by climate change moving forward. And if we want to mitigate those changes, we need to get everybody to the table and give them a way to take action. All of this can be talked about through a climate change lens, through a trees lens, through a sustainability lens, through an inclusion lens. I don't think there's anything stopping us from making everything we do climate relevant, if that's the direction we want to take. And I think for me personally, for my department, it certainly is. So I'm really looking forward to hearing what questions you guys have. I'll bring Maria back in to introduce the breakout room theme, and then I'm excited to hear from everyone about what you guys are doing or what questions you have for us.
All right, are we all back? I think. How was that stakeholder analysis for the 7 minutes that you had to look at it? It is challenging, but it's certainly worth the time to sit down and think about it a little bit. It's certainly not something that can just be quickly jotted down, but
that's what we learned. We learned that. We learned that it's a lot easier to fill out column 1 than the other 2 columns. But I think it does teach the lesson that it's really helpful to sort of banter this around with some other people and bring those questions to the forefront.
Well, Joe, I think I can turn things back over to you now.
Thanks. Just looking, it doesn't look like we have any questions in the chat. So if anybody has any questions right now, you can feel free to unmute and ask, and we'll do our best to answer. Yes, Janet?
Yeah, I was wondering if how some of you have communicated with your boards about climate change. I recall a few years ago where a couple of our board members got into quite a heated argument about politics, right and left. And so, I'm just thinking about a number of, I think that all of our trustees certainly are concerned about climate change, and they certainly are believers. I'm just wondering about how, if you have any tips on how you have communicated with your board so that they're not, say, I don't know that I want them to be alarmed. I want them to be concerned, and I want them to know that we're taking it seriously. Any suggestions?
So, Janet, I think that's a great question. And that actually, I think, was some of the hesitation on behalf of the Morton Arboretum. I will say that we address this by really saying that science is not red or blue. Science is science. And we think science says this is real. This is something we have to take action on, and we would like to communicate to the public about it. And the board, to their credit, heard that and said, you are the experts. If this is the direction the institution is taking, we are comfortable with it, because we had the science to back it up.
And I would also interject, I'm actually on 2 boards. That's my involvement with public gardens. And they're very different boards and very different demographics. But what I have found is important, because I always try to advance that message within the board and working with the staff. But what I've found effective is expanding the diversity of the board, frankly, because in the board that I work with that is more homogeneous, it's a much harder sell. And in the board that is more diverse, we've been more successful in advancing a sustainability message.
Good point. Thank you.
This is Richard at Phipps. I would second that. I
Richard?
think our expanding the board and the diversity of the board has really helped us be able to get that message out and get everybody on board. That's really helpful.
Great. Thank you.
Does anyone have any other questions right now?
Joe, I actually had a question for everyone about the stakeholder document. We actually, in our breakout room, didn't get to it at all, but I was wondering if any of you had any experience developing audience personas, because there's a lot of overlap there in terms of, just imagining who a stakeholder is to the conversation, kind of going through who they are as individuals, what they're looking for, and then how your institution can address it. So I found it interesting that it came up in a slightly different perspective here. It's very relevant to a lot of people that have, created programs for specific audiences.
Phipps has done stakeholder personas for different projects. And that has been more in depth for what we've done with our science communication workshops, but now I've got an idea for more in-depth projects for science communication training, but that could be really useful, really diving into specific individuals, who they are, what they care about, what their passions are, what they think and their education is, etc. And I'll just continue, we also didn't talk too much about the stakeholder groups, but we did talk about the issues that some gardens face in more conservative areas of the country. And we didn't really mention it too much in our talk, but I was talking with some folks in Texas. Catherine Hayhoe is a famous climate scientist, evangelical Christian from Texas, teaches in Texas, and has conversations with everybody about climate change. But often when she has these conversations, she doesn't use the phrase climate change. And I should put a link to her website in the chat. She is just a fantastic public speaker, just engages with the public in such a personal and empathetic way. And I really suggest looking to her if you are in an area where you might struggle with talking about climate change. Maria's got it. Maria just put it in the chat. Thank you, Maria.
I'll add that as well, randomly. I hope this isn't too random, but I have a 4-year-old in my household, and she watches a marine biology show called Octonauts, if any of you are familiar with them. They don't use the word climate change either, but they teach about polar ice caps melting, and they teach about sea level rise and bleaching of coral, but they don't give it that name. And I thought that was really fascinating.
Abby, I meant to look up the name of the documentary before I came in today, but there is it's a sea turtle documentary. It focuses on Kemp's Ridley sea turtles. The director's name is Michelle Gomes. And what was fascinating is it's an entire documentary about sea turtles strandings, and for this particular species, why they are happening with greater frequency. But it interviews a number of different folks from federal agencies, and they're describing every step of the way climate change and its impacts, but they never use the phrase climate change throughout the documentary. They're talking about the beaches getting warmer when turtles are laying their eggs, which is having a greater effect on the ratios of male to female hatchlings. They're talking about ocean currents changing, but they never actually use the phrase climate change. All the rest of the science is there, but I'm going to look that up real quick. In case anyone's interested, I'll drop in the chat.
Sounds like the power of stories.
You know, that's how we started talking about climate change. Was we started calling it weather events, because I'm in Hawaii, and in Hawaii we have, everybody understands weather events, right? We have hurricanes, we have floods, we have all of those things. So when you talk about it in terms of adapting to climate events or weather events, that was just a way to get the conversation started, at least. Now we hit it more straight on with climate change.
I'm kind of going back to your point about audience personas doing it. I was thinking about it in terms of like trigger words and like, you know, thinking through our audience and what words they might be triggered by, I think could be super useful to help us think through exactly what we're talking about. You know, what are things that resonate with those people that are climate change adjacent, that can sort of get us in that direction, open the door.
Okay, we've come up on the hour. Be happy to see if anybody has a last minute question, be happy to put it to the group. Otherwise, any questions? All right, well, I want to be cognizant of everyone's time. I just want to thank you all again for attending and thank our speakers, Sarah, Marie, and Jeremy. A recording this webinar will be made available to participants to share with others, and we'll send you a link in the coming week. In the meantime, we hope you'll join our technical advisory committee if you're interested. Certainly, we hope you'll register your institution to join the toolkit, share what you're doing. The toolkit, we also have lots of different resources on there. We're continuing to add to it every week. So please check it out. There's lots of great information on there. And hope to talk to you all again soon. And thank you very much and have a wonderful evening. Thanks.